What are we talking about in this case? Then moving forward, what it is that we are going to do to say that this thing actually did not work. It didn't work. But then to say, take responsibility
I don't
for
understand.
it. At that
When you say it didn't work, what do you mean?
It did. I mean, the whole leasing of the equipment didn't work.
Yes.
The process moving forward to try and sort it out is what we are dealing with right now at this point.
Yes.
Dealing with it to say, okay, how are we going to make it happen? But at the same time, you're not being clear in terms of what you've done. And again, to say that people are going to continue to point fingers.
They will, even if you're clear, they will. But you will have set the agenda and the discussion will be something that is within your purview. Now, again, the people who are in charge of communication in those various ministries need to look at how they do their business, because something that may be clear and straightforward, simply because of a lack or an absence of clear communication, can look very muddled and very confusing and very incompetent.
Right.
And yet that is actually not the case. Yes.
It's not the case.
Yes.
But see, this is the thing. And I know that a lot of arguments will come and then ask, how are we supposed to then be able to handle so many things? It comes with the territory. It comes with a job to say that, yes, you need to keep your muzzle on communication. You need to keep your muzzle on transparency. You need to keep your muzzle on so many things to make sure that you do actually have control of what's going on. And yes, absolutely control the narrative. Because at the end of the day, still without this information, CT, what it would be very clear to very many people is that all this money that was spent actually then was for nothing again. Looking at public coffers then being used for other matters as opposed to what they should actually be used for. And unfortunately, that's the story that then comes out. And that is what people are going to ride with.
Yes, they are. Aren't they?
Yes, I mean, of course, without sharing the proper information. And I think that's one of the things that we deal with, whether it comes from contractual or understanding or perception or whatever it really is. If we're not giving up, I think this is the thing, that because of a culture of not wanting to share information, because of the fact that you're covering something up at some point, that is where we get to where we are now. That people don't necessarily feel that they need to share because the culture has been that we're not going to tell people what's going on because then it allows us to benefit in one way or another.
You know, they may not even actually deliberately hide information. They could, but sometimes it's just a simple factor of incompetence. Somebody may have a job that they are not aptly qualified to actually carry through, because you can't have a situation where constantly there's a deficit in correct information, constantly. But you see, it's not just in the Ministry of Health. You see it in other ministries as well, and you wonder, the person who's supposed to communicate this, let me bring it home. We ourselves in the media, how often do you look at an article and ask, what on earth was this
going on here
doing when they wrote this? Because they are not giving you information that is useful. So you question, do they actually know how to present this information? Because they may have the information. For instance, we've talked about reporting on health matters, haven't we? It requires a certain specialized training.
Absolutely.
Yes. Now, if somebody's reporting on health matters and they're reporting the way they would report a crime, that information will not bear the same weight as it should. So again, this seems to be something that needs to be looked into because, one, from a reporting perspective of how we in the media report what we are told or what we know, and also from what we hear or from what the people who are actually making their case and how they make their case. Yes, so we also have a part to play in this.
We also have a part to play in all of this. The conversation continues right here in the Situation Room. In the next hour, we're going to be talking once again with Irungu Houghton, and we're going to be looking at trying to end extrajudicial killings in this country. Of course, Irungu is the executive director of Amnesty International, and he'll be talking with us after 8. Right now, we're going to take a look at what's happening on the roads, and then we'll come back and continue with that conversation. It's around about 8 o'clock, and we will continue in the conversation in the Situation Room later in Kenya's biggest conversation. All right, traffic on Thika Road this morning, of course, leading off from what's happening in Kasarani Mwiki area, and the road is still presenting with some problems, folks. That means people are not able to move as quickly as they would, and that is affecting traffic then on Thika Road. The jam is building up just before the Mathari Hospital, and then that is taking us one lane there just around Survey. All right, the deadlock in the CBD is more costly, and it's taking people a long time to get in and out of the CBD. Mombasa Road, of course, we we see that it still continues. We'll see how that opens up in a short while.
.5 Spice FM, Kisumu. This is the Situation Room, the home of hard-hitting political commentary and penetrating insights about the state of the nation. This is a talk radio experience like no other. The Situation Room, a place for hard truths, debates, and elevated conversations. The Situation Room, witty, political, engaging, deep, controversial. In the room, we have C.T. Muga, researcher, academic, seasoned political observer, a fountain of wisdom in these politically uncertain times. Ndu Oko.
The only way to start your day, of course, this is Kenya's biggest conversation. You're in the Situation Room this morning on Spice FM. If you're tuned in Nairobi, you're listening on 94.4, and in Nakuru, you're on 96.0, in Mombasa on 87.9, in Eldoret on 96.7, 90.9 in Nyeri, 102.5 in Kisumu, and 97.7 in Malindi. My name is Ndoko, and I'm here in the studio with Siti Muga today and having a look at conversations that are happening. We're joined by the Executive Director of Amnesty International, Irungo Houghton. It's good to have you in the Situation Room once again. Karibu sana.
Thank you very much, sir.
Great to have you here. Of course, we're looking at obviously work that you do, and of course making the news, making the stories, making the headlines, extrajudicial killings in this country, specific to Kenya, and necessarily exactly what is going on, and saying, are we going to be able to get to a place where we end, and this will not be a story that we continue to tell. I would like to look at the process and the progress and say, here we are today in 2020. Where are we?
So one is, yesterday was the anniversary of the killing of Dedan Kimathi, and I was struck really with the sense of history. And extrajudicial killings didn't just start in this period or with this generation. It really started back in the colonial period. One of our famous heroines, Mary Muthoni Nyanjiro, was killed outside of, what is now the Norfolk Hotel. And she was killed protesting against the arrest of Harry Thuku, one of our foremost nationalists.
Right.
And that was one of the first extrajudicial killings that we know. So it is something that has been around since the colonial period. But as obviously, we don't want it to go for another 100 years.
Right.
This is something that is completely within our grasp as a nation to eradicate, and I believe it could happen in our generation.
On what does this on what does this hold fast to? What must happen for that to take place? Because certain things, it's not just going to be a declaration. I won't just snap my fingers and say, okay, we need to see this end, and it ends. Yeah. On what bedrock must this be placed? So
I think the first thing that we have to recognize is that there are statistics on this. This is not a hidden problem. The Missing Voices website that has been working for two or 3 years now just released their annual report last week. In fact, they did it on Valentine's Day, which probably shocked a lot of people.
Right.
But there was a method there. There was an opportunity really to offer flowers to the widows and to the mothers of people who have lost their loved ones, And just if I can go through some of the statistics from that report, over 2019, we lost about 107 young people. What we know from the data is that 1/5, about 20% of those people died between the months of March and April. So this is the 2 months that we're leaning into now. We also know that about half of them were based in the county of Nairobi. We also know that 69% of them were between the ages of 18 and 35. This is a very young demographic. It is probably the most productive. And I guess we can call it the majority demographic. They're young people. About 72% of those cases were justified by the police as lawful killings. We would disagree with many of those cases, and I can give you specific examples, including the young Duncan Githinji, who was 2 years old, was shot by 3 bullets in Soweto, Kasarani, and as we speak now, there's only an inquest, despite the fact that the officers are known. About 10% of the cases, of these 107 cases, have led to arrests of officers. So only 10%.
So we're looking at
of these cases.
All these deaths having been brought about by the hand of the police.
Yes, these are all police shootings.
So there's justification then to say these are extrajudicial?
No, the law provides for police officers to protect other Kenyans, to protect themselves, to protect property. And that law is an important law because we don't want a situation where our officers, both our male and female officers in uniform, to be threatened by criminals or by thugs, or to be unable to protect us. I mean, this is why we have a police service. It is to protect Kenyans primarily. So not all of those cases, not all of the cases where police officers discharge their weapons are unlawful. But the cases that we have looked at under the Missing Voices project are essentially suspicious, and we would say that they are unlawful killings.
Has justice been expedited in any? Because if we're looking and saying that here, these are cases where people have been killed outside of the parameters of the law or what they are required or allowed to do. Has justice then been expedited in any of these cases?
I mean, the thing that worries most of us who are following this, I know it keeps the Inspector General up at night, and I'm sure it keeps the Minister of Interior up at night. I hope so. I mean, any decent policymaker or any decent civil servant would be very concerned that a government is essentially allowing a situation where officers, either for purposes of corruption or for purposes of just pure violence and violence against other citizens, that they would allow this to happen. And I hope this does keep people up at night until we find a solution. But I think the examples are, less than 10% of the cases I've given you have led to arrests. We know that there is a policy of transferring officers rather than interdicting them or arresting them. We have I don't think there's one case where we've seen an immediate arrest of an officer for shooting a citizen. And, it would be great to have the police spokesperson on this show also to just respond to these issues. So I don't think that we have a zero tolerance to unlawful killings yet. And the reason for that, I think, is that the public have not really made this a big agenda. And as we say in Amnesty, the violent policing is not an answer to violent crime. So there are people out there who are frightened, who are being terrorized by criminals. We've had cases in places like Madara and Dandora and other places where women are unable to walk at night. And that is also a human rights violation. So the police have to be able to provide protection, but they cannot also prey on other Kenyans.
Well, of course, the question comes in then, who polices whom? Because if you're asking then, what we're basically asking is that you then look within yourselves where we find fault, right? And then do something about that. What is the likelihood that I'm going to actually say, I am the one who has done this, and then I then should have some kind of punishment on myself? It's very low. How then do we deal with it? This is the thing. How then do you deal with an issue like that?
Yeah. I mean, I guess the glimmer of light is that we're 10 years into the Constitution. This is the decade, the first decade of our Constitution. And what it has given us is it has given us laws, it has given us structures, it has given us policies that we can use to tackle these issues. This was not the case back in 2010. Let me just give you a few of them. The Inspector General is an independent institution. It is not at the beck and call of the executive. That's the first important thing. So his priority focus must be on professionalizing the police service, right? There can be no other purpose for an Inspector General but to create a professional, modern police force that is humane and is effective in fighting crime. The second thing is that we now have two other institutions, the Independent Policing Oversight Authority and we have the Internal Affairs Unit. Those two units need to be on the ground constantly whenever these incidents happen. And in the case of Daniel Borough, and I do hope we'll be able to get the National Border Association chairperson to come in. In the case of this young 24-year-old border rider who was essentially a good Samaritan, and he was shot in the chest simply for refusing to pay 50 shillings to come into Mama Lucy Hospital to essentially deliver a child that actually died. I mean, this was a golden hour moment. Not only did we lose the child, but we lost the Good Samaritan.
Right.
And we lost the Good Samaritan at the hands of a police officer. I mean, this is completely bizarre in many ways. So there are institutions now that prevent this from happening. But I think what I would like to see as Amnesty is I would like to see the Police Inspector General taking immediate action on officers. They need to be suspended and interdicted, not transferred.
I mean, yeah, for sure. And we're going to try and see if we can get the chairman on the phone, of course, later to pick up that case. If we look at cases that we saw, for example, in Kisumu about a month ago, of course, there was a case where a boy, we're going to call him a boy, he was under 20, and he was trying to help his cousin who had been hit by a vehicle, trying to get him to hospital. And then thereafter, police came on the scene without many questions asked. He was shot, lost his life. There's another boy in hospital. The questions were asked to the regional commissioner thereafter, and that case has essentially died. We don't hear that anybody was brought to book. Nobody was brought to question. He said he was going to have a conversation with his officers, and that is where it ended. Now, how are we going to see cases like this take center stage where something will actually be done about them? Because then essentially nobody asked the question that this life that has been lost, what are we going to do about it?
So that particular case, I think is the case of Mark Ochieng.
Yes.
And in many ways, it was also complicated in the sense that it was a public order case. I mean, what happened was, a young man, actually a boy, a 17-year-old boy by the name of Kevin Sumba, was knocked by a car, and then a altercation happened between the police and the public, and it ended fatally in the death of Mark Ochieng. And I think there are a number of concerns there. First of all is the speed at which police officers discharge their weapons. I mean, the question is really, why do we have police officers with live bullets doing traffic control? Right? I mean, this is the first question that we should be asking, because it's just a split second for that weapon to be discharged, and we lose a life. From what we know, Mark Ochieng was unarmed. He was, yes, maybe among a crowd of people that were challenging the police officers, but that was no reason to have him
essentially
shot
challenging them for this vehicle that knocked down his
Correct.
cousin, right?
Correct. Actually, he was seeking justice in that moment.
At that point.
So I think one of the things that we have to demand from the police is for them to review the way in which they manage public order. And we don't have much time. If you think about this is what we call the sane season. This is the season in between the electoral periods. When we move into the crazy season, you have the complexity of people struggling with their basic living costs, people struggling with law and order issues, but you have on top of that electoral dynamics where the political class is whipping their followers in any direction. And I think what I'm worried about is that if we don't deal with this in 2020, 2021, we are likely to see a repeat of 2017.
Let me ask the question. If you look at, say, for instance, the killing of Osama bin Laden or Qasem Soleimani, would it fall under the broad category of extrajudicial killing?
So I'm not familiar with those two cases. I mean, it's an interesting conversation, but and I know I was asked this question about Osama bin Laden by Jerry Thorne, so I should perhaps have done my homework and come to the session. I think for us the definition of an extrajudicial killing is a distinct one, and it is distinct in the sense that from a legal perspective, a government declares war on a category of people. Now, in this case, we have no declaration of war by the Kenyan government. There is no policy that says shoot 107 people every year and essentially make sure that 69% of them are between the ages of 18 and 35. We have no policy like that. As Amnesty and as the human rights organizations in our community, what we are saying is there must be a policy to ensure that violent policing, unlawful killings, I guess we'd call disproportionate use of force comes to an end. And we do not see violent policing as a response to violent crime, even if that is the case.
Even if that is the case. I'm sure you've had many conversations, and I want to assume that, of course, you've had conversations with those who, as Amnesty or as other, invested groups, with the leadership of the police, for example. I would really be interested in what the response has been. Do they acknowledge the fact that these things actually are occurring?
So we have, for every time Amnesty goes into the public or is involved in a media action of some sort on an extrajudicial killing, we probably have 3 or 4 interactions with the police service, and sometimes at very high levels, either the level of the Inspector General or the Minister of Interior. In fact, 2 months ago, he made a very large conference, chuckle in laughter by saying that he has monthly communion with the Amnesty Executive Director. And people were not quite sure what he meant by this. But what it means is that we are actually in conversation, we are actually in dialogue with the authorities, because we believe that it is their responsibility. It's not the responsibility of average citizens or the Border Association or Amnesty International to keep people safe. It is the responsibility of the state. And we will not tire of reminding them on every case that happens that this is not happening, or congratulating them when they take action. And there have been cases, and this is to the heart of your question, there have been cases where we have seen the minister move decisively. The police reforms that were announced 2 years ago were a decisive moment. The invitation to human rights organizations to come and speak truth to police officers in the National Policing Conference a year ago was a decisive moment. The arrests of, or the interdictions of the officers that were caught in a viral video beating up a student at Jomo Kenyatta University College, that interdiction was a decisive movement. What we are not seeing really is a zero tolerance for these cases. And I think we continue to call on the Inspector General not to rely on IPOA, not to rely on the Internal Affairs Unit. It is a managerial, administrative responsibility of the Inspector General to discipline his officers. And if he cannot discipline his officers, then at the lower levels, the county commissioners, the sub-commanders and the officers in charge of the stations, they are culpable when their officers take action and they're not disciplined.
But if we discuss the outcomes of these actions, which lead to what we call extrajudicial killing, is the question of why these things occur, is it asked enough?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, CK, that's a great question. I mean, do we spend enough time thinking about what are the conditions that give rise to unlawful policing and the excessive use of force? And I think that for me, there are 3 things that I've learned in the last 2 years, and I've come into Amnesty, and it's really this is also a new area for me. But the first is that we tend to blame one party or the other. And we don't understand the ecosystem, the context in which this happens. So there are neighborhoods that are extremely violent, right? So it's neither violent crimes nor violent policing. It's neither criminals nor police. We need to understand this as a way in which we keep all people safe. And that's the first one. I can hear the music going, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, we're going to take a break in a short while and have a look at weather, but it's very interesting for us to then come back and then understand how we're going to be able to look at this against some of the things that you're talking about. Now, for example, where you have dangerous communities, dangerous neighborhoods, dangerous areas, then is that justification for some of the, the violence and the killings that we see? We're in the Situation Room. We're in the room this morning with the Executive Director of Amnesty International, Irungo Houghton, and we're looking at possibly ending extrajudicial killings in the country. We're going to take a break now, look at what's happening with the weather, and then we'll come back and continue the conversation. All right, in Nairobi, currently at 18 degrees. We're looking at partly cloudy conditions with a high of 28 and a low of 16. It's going to be clear skies in Mombasa at 28 degrees, highs of 32 and lows of 26. 22 degrees in Kisumu, sunny conditions through the day, partly cloudy conditions later with highs of 30 and lows of 20. 17 degrees in Nakuru, partly cloudy conditions, highs of 26 and lows of 14. It's 27 degrees in Malindi and partly cloudy. This is going to be through the day with highs of 32. In Nyeri at 17 degrees. It's going to be partly cloudy this morning. Rain showers expected later with highs of 24 and lows of 14. A quick look at what's happening in Kampala, and we'll see partly cloudy and rainy conditions later on, currently at 21 degrees with a high of 28 and a low of 20. And finally, we take a look in Dar es Salaam, where it's partly cloudy conditions through the day and seeing highs of 33 and lows of 26. This is Kenya's biggest conversation. You're tuned into the Situation Room on Spice FM. I'm Andrew O'Connor in the room this morning with CT Muga.
Mature, intelligent talk every morning. Spice up yourself.
This morning we're looking at that word. It's the judicial that gets
Mornings done right. 94.4 Spice FM, Nairobi.
Killings in this country and saying that, is it a possibility? Where are we with all of this? We're going to continue with that point that you had, Irungu, at some point. But right now, we have the case that we talked about yesterday, or today, rather. And we have on the line Kevin Mubadi, who is the chair of the Association of Border Riders. He's on the line right now and probably going to give us a little bit more insight in terms of what happened and what they planned for today. Kevin, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
I'm very fine, but not that much fine.
Tell us what makes you not fine this morning. Irungu gave us a little bit about this information of what you planned for today, based on what happened. Yes. Based on what happened with one of your members.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes. The sad news came in yesterday, where one of our members was just trying to rescue a child who was drowning in the river, and he was taking him to Mama Lucy Hospital. But when he arrived at the hospital, this was an emergency case, and so he had to rush into the hospital and parked the motorbike, took the child inside. When he came out, there was this security guard who was there, and he wanted some bribe, that is 50 shillings for the parking, for allowing him to park inside. But when the rider said that, no, I was just trying to rescue a child who was in danger, and I don't have this much money to pay right now. So they started some scuffle with the security guard, who refused to release the motorbike to him.
Right.
But when the security guard saw that the guy has refused to pay, so he called the police and told the police that this guy is unruly and he's causing some mayhem there. So when the police officer, the AP officer came, the scuffle continued, but because the police and the riders, they always have this tendency of how do you call it, madarau. Yani they take riders as a nobody, So what happens? The police just cocked the gun and shot the guy in the chest. And when he was rushed into the hospital, inside the hospital, in an emergency room, the guy died there.
And this happened yesterday.
Yeah, it happened yesterday. The police officer disappeared. There was some little scuffle. People tried to demonstrate, but as an organization, we have alerted all our members not to demonstrate, because as an organization, are trying to see a reform in the sector, and we just want justice to be done in a transparent way. We don't want to cause mayhem. We don't want to do demonstrations. I have urged all our members to keep calm. We want to follow this issue in a civil way. So today we are going to have a press briefing to update our members and the public on this issue. But we just urge the IPOA, the Inspector General of Police, the CS Interior, Dr. Matiang'i, to ensure that justice is done to this lady. The guy was only 24 years, a very young man, hardworking, earning a living. He was not a thief. You see, and he was a good Samaritan. Right. He was just trying to save this
somebody,
child.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, he was helping somebody. So you help someone and you die. You rescue someone as you die. It's very, very painful. And when you look at the mother of this young man, it is like they have taken away his source of income. The only thing that maybe he had that would provide for her. And losing a child of 24 years, something very painful after suffering all those years trying to bring him up. Yeah. So it's a very painful day for us as a border community, but we are just keeping calm. We have urged all our members to keep calm and to ensure that the government follows this issue and justice be done to this young man.
Essentially, what you will do today is a protest. That's what's going to happen. Whether it will be silent, non-violent, it's going to be a protest. Do you think that it's going to... Do you hope?
No. What you have urged for now, we don't want to do some protest.
So you're
want our
sharing information to be aware of what's going on.
Yes, today we will meet at Uhuru Park with the media fraternity, just to share a statement on what is going on and what we want the government to do for us.
Do you think that?
But we are not going to do demonstration.
Okay. Do you think that is going to be enough at this point?
At this point, because the government has not come out to tell us what is happening, because they already said that the investigation have started. So for the time being, as a civil people, we want to give them time and chance to ensure that things work out well. Maybe later, if they are not going to act, that's when now the demonstration can come in. But at the moment, it is still early stage. We are giving the government a chance to prove that they mean whatever they say. Yes.
All right. Kevin, thank you very much for speaking to us. Of course, we'll be following this and finding out, what happened during the day today. On that, of course, the losses of one is much too much, and it's something that has to be followed. And thank you very much for joining us in the Situation Room this morning and telling us about this particular incident.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
The thing that I think sometimes gets a bit confusing, if you sort of like Google search and you look at countries that have records of judicial killing, the issue is which ones do you leave
Where
out?
do you start?
Yeah, well, where do you stop? Because one, the Southern American countries, it's like you can pinpoint almost any country you think. If you go to Southeast Asia, same story. If you come to this continent, again, for every stone you will throw, you'll probably hit every country that there is. Now, this is why I asked the question, do we ask enough? Why is it that, because for something to happen that frequently, it's being allowed to.
Yeah, by the time, Irungu, that you're able to, get statistics, right? You have numbers year in, year out. That means it's happening at a rate that is enough for you then to collect these statistics.
Let me give an
right?
example. Usually when you have criminals, especially in the areas that were referred to by Irungu as dangerous, you'll hear, say, the Minister for Interior saying, I have given a shoot to kill order. Now, is that not giving express permission for extrajudicial killing?
Right, because if we're going to, it might sound like a very naive question, right, Irungu, but if we're going to talk about extrajudicial killings, then that means then there are judicial killings. There are those that are allowed. So where do we cross the line?
So I guess there's two levels of this conversation, which is a great conversation to have. The first is, what are the drivers of extrajudicial killings? Right? What is it that generates? And I think there are probably three levels. The first is high levels of inequality, low levels of hope, low levels of opportunity for jobs, for employment. I mean, what we've been told by community organizers in places like Dandora and Mathare, that when the National Youth Service program was running, and we were actually occupying people in lawful, lucrative jobs, you saw a dip in the crime, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is the criminal justice system is not working. Where you have a loss of faith, a loss of confidence that somebody who is arrested will have their chance to plead their innocence in court. They will have a lawyer. They'll be processed through a separation between an investigator, a prosecutor, a judge, and then they will go into the correctional services. And that system works. You tend not to have this situation where people say the best thing is just shoot them.
Right.
Our prisons are full.
Yeah.
Right.
We're not having the conversation.
Yeah. The third level is really the lack of leadership and the lack of managerial oversight that says this is unacceptable. This is not policing. This is not a way in which you reduce levels of crime. Essentially, what you're doing is creating a much more violent society, because what the criminals know that actually there's going to be no opportunity for them to go to court. So the first thing they will do is they will fire back. And in many cases, you will have deaths as a result of the altercation between police officers and violent criminals. And those are, I guess, in those circumstances, it is lawful for a police officer to protect themselves or to protect other people or to protect property. It is lawful for that to happen. That is actually under our laws. But in many cases, what we are seeing is that this is not the case. That what you have is a underworld of criminals and police officers who are essentially meshed together in interest of extortion. And, I think for me the concern is that we are not seeing a decisive set of actions that are bringing this to an end. And I can just give you two examples. Carlton Minor, the 24-year-old from 22-year-old from Kibra, who was killed in December last year. It is now 14 months since that he's been killed. No single officer has been arrested.
I would like to know, I think it would be very interesting for us to know the process and where we are at this point, because then I would ask another question, but I'm going to have to ask that after we take a look at what's happening on the roads. You are tuned into Kenya's biggest conversation in the Situation Room this morning. I'm going to take a look at what's happening with traffic, and we're going to come back and continue this discussion in terms of what's happening with extrajudicial killings in this country. you get into the city, well, okay, I exaggerate just a little bit, but okay, it's not as bad as it was yesterday. And you can get there or into the city using this road much better. Red Hill Road, as you approach Limuru Road, is not moving. A lot of people using that as an alternative, but this morning you're going to have to find another alternative. Of course, getting to the Westlands roundabout from Wayakiwe is not so bad either this morning. We still have some issues on Mombasa Road today. Is gridlock at some points, opened at others, but Mombasa Road, of course, we still have that issue. Jogo Road getting to the city centre from the City Stadium roundabout, not too bad. It's moving, albeit slowly, but it's moving anyway. On Thika Road today, joining from Kiambu Road, joining from Muthaiga, you get to a gridlock right around the Utali Drift, and then moving down further to the Pangani underpass. Not so bad. So traffic isn't so terrible on this Wednesday morning, unless you find a route where you might be stuck. Do let us know. Spice FM KE on Twitter, or give us a call on 0719 012 600. Let us know what you see, and we'll spread the word.
Spice FM.
In the Situation Room this morning, we're looking at extrajudicial killings.
Mature.
We have with us the Executive Director of Amnesty International, Irungu Houghton. And of just before we went into break, giving us those two examples, Irungu, of cases where we see that, it could be that we're at a standstill, nothing is happening, time has elapsed, and the questions are still in the air.
So I think one of the things, some good news. I think let's also kind of look on the bright side. So from what we hear from community organizers in places like Kibra and Dandora, that actually extrajudicial killings and violent policing reduced last year, right? Which is interesting.
And why is that?
So their analysis essentially is that the publicity that that was drawn to this issue in 2018 was enough to create a deterrent. But the other thing they said was that there were some leadership changes at the level of the police service. And that's why I have hope that when you have officers that understand the purpose of why they are there, it is possible to change, divisions and to change, police, areas that are policed by particular jurisdictions. So, the getting the right officers in the places where there are high levels of violence actually makes a difference. And I think one of the things that we would be, looking at, more intensely in 2020 is beginning to look at actually who is responsible, who are the sub-commanders, what we used to call the officer in charge of the police divisions. Who are they in relationship to the numbers that we are seeing? So we can begin to make a link between this particular, police manager, if I can use, language that is not, but this police commander. They're managers.
They are essentially managers,
yes. Chief executive. There's a chief executive. There's a managers. How are they managing the professionalism of the police officers below them? And is there a relationship between the levels of crime in a particular area, the levels of extrajudicial killings in a particular area, vis-a-vis the officer in charge of that area? And I think this is the other thing that is clear to us, is that when you have officers that want to make a difference, that difference will happen.
If we do, it sounds though that it sounds like something that's up in the air and wrapped in theory.
No. Statistically, I'm telling you, the numbers of people who died,
but having it
in
established,
Dandora and Kibra reduced last year.
Right, but if we're going to
say that... It didn't happen in Madare. It didn't happen in Kaloleni.
Sure, but it seems that the crux of the matter here would be to have such replicated across the country, whereby we have other volatile areas. But then it is still within the purview of the person at the top to make these appointments. Yeah. How do we then influence at that level?
So accountability happens at various, very, very many levels. And for your viewers, many of them are not police officers. I'm sure some of them are police officers, so that the message is clear for them. But for normal citizens, the question is, what can we do about this issue? right? And I've said this to senior government officers. If your children do not have T-shirts that say, I am the child of the cabinet secretary, I am the child of a principal secretary, don't shoot me. You are likely to have a situation where your children, your very family members, are as much risk as the children that we see in places like Dandora and for that matter, in the coast as well, because that's another area where we've been really concerned about extrajudicial killings. So the message to citizens really is that they need to raise these issues as much as possible. They need to join organizations and support organizations.
That was going to be my next question. Where? How? Because that's the thing. A lot of people will say that, okay, I can do this. I can talk about it in my local area. Whom? I mean, practically, Irungu, who are people supposed to go to? Where are you supposed to raise this? Because, of course, there's a general feeling that, talk about police. Look, the question is that they don't give a damn. Right? Kill somebody, it's a nuisance they've gotten rid of.
Right.
And that could be the general thinking. We don't know what the thinking is of each and every police officer, but it's the perception that it is a general thinking that you've gotten rid of a nuisance.
Yeah, I mean, that perspective, we put it slightly differently. Your silence as a citizen kills people, right? Your disdain or your disinterest in what happens around violent policing is actually part of the cause that this continues to happen. The more people who write, for example, yesterday we saw this case of Daniel Boro. How many citizens picked up a pen? In the old days, we used to pick up pens. In these days, probably we type something.
Right.
How many people wrote a letter to the Minister of Interior, to the Inspector General, and said, I want this investigated? How many members of parliament received letters from their constituents saying this issue happened in a particular constituency? What is the level of oversight that the police are now expected to have from the parliamentary committees? What Amnesty International, what are you doing about this issue? I mean, one of the things that, that really gives us courage and gives us a sense of purpose is when the public reach out to us and say, we don't want you to be silent on this issue. So there are things that can happen. There are social justice centers, about 18 of them in this country. They're community-based paralegal, legal aid centers. They are operating on purely fumes and air. We celebrated the first, the life of Caroline Mwatha about a week ago, last Saturday. And she died, as people probably remember, about a year ago. And she was a volunteer that essentially took statements from family members of people who had been killed by police officers. Now, she was a complete volunteer. She had no salary. She basically had to do a side hustle in order to feed her family. But this is something that she did with very meager meals. My question is, if we have an emerging middle class in this country, how long do you want human rights protection to be supported by middle class communities outside of the country? And at what point does it become important to you to be able to get into your car knowing that you will be safe, be able to go to a mall knowing that you'll be safe, knowing that you can get to a hospital like Mama Lucy, and not have a situation where another human being, is killed for 50 shillings?
Because that's it, right?
That's it.
Something as simple as that.
That's
50
the dividing line.
Is the reason. 50 shillings is the reason why this individual was killed yesterday.
No.
Aha.
No.
CK will.
Is this something else?
No.
At this point, they asked him to pay the 50 shillings. They got into a scuffle.
The person who wanted the 50 shillings and the person who actually did the shooting, two different incidences here. This is an AP. A lot of these killings seem to have been, every time it comes up, you hear the term AP more often than regular police. So you have to ask the question, what is it about the training of the APs? What is it about the way they go about their business that makes them come to the fore every time you hear of, when you have a police shooting or killing, it is more likely to be an AP. Why?
Of course.
And it isn't 50 shillings.
The perception is rife that the administration police and their training, for example, and this could be something that could be looked at. When we look, of course, we're looking at the side where there needs to be public participation. And if you have a rising middle class that needs to then do something about it, even by using the tool of voice. However, on the side of training, which is something that needs to be looking at, a lot of people have a blatant fear of the administration police because of how they've been trained, and they give off this feeling of, we really don't care. Y'all are, vermin that we will have to get rid of to reach our expected end. That's the perception that a lot of people have.
Remember the case of a lawyer and the client who were killed. The people involved in this case, again, were APs. peace. You see, when I raised the question, it was specific and deliberate. You cannot have cases of this sort recurring as often as these, and you don't ask the question, why? What is it about it? It's not just policemen think they can get away with it. That plays a part into it. But what sort of mindset is it that these particular individuals have that makes it their solution to a problem is do away with the person who seems to be at the heart of the problem?
So there are a couple of things here. First of all, the person that that demanded the 50 shillings was the guard at the Mamalusi hospital. So
yes.
you're technically correct, CT. But it was the same officer, security officer, who referred this young man to the administrative police. The bigger question, I think, is an interesting one, which is the administrative police more violent? Is it more lawless than the regular police service?
That's the perception out there, Rongo.
Perception, but I think it's important that Kenyans understand this. In 2018, the president stood before the nation and said that he is going to bring the command and control of both of these arms of the police service under the Inspector General. So, frankly speaking, I mean, we lost it because we got fascinated by blue uniforms. And this is somehow, as citizens, we have to be a bit more focused in terms of watching the state. It wasn't really about putting all the officers in one uniform. It was really about bringing all the officers under one command structure. So, frankly speaking, it doesn't matter whether it was an administrative police officer that killed, that did kill Duncan Burrow, or a regular police officer. What is important is that that administrative officer, the two officers that were there, that they are under a sub-commander. And that sub-commander is responsible for all the police services, all the law enforcement agencies, including chiefs, for that matter, and including the Directorate of Criminal Investigations, because that is the new structure that we've got. And then the question, therefore, is, once we know who is responsible for holding that officer accountable, the question is there human rights education, human rights training that needs to be accelerated among the police? Does
it exist? Let's ask the question.
So
if it
at
actually
Kiganjo,
exists.
there are courses that are, that happen within the police service, or police cadets as they essentially graduate to go to the streets. But the concern really is that they may not really be, two levels of intervention, and this is. It's beginning to happen. So the first intervention is regular human rights conversations with human rights organizations. I mean, one of the things that I take a lot of time to do is to actually meet with police officers, because I like to get into their own understanding of their role, because then you can understand the pressures that they have, the inabilities that they find themselves, and also what is it that makes a police officer snap and shoot somebody rather than arrest them. Right? And I think that's something that I think all human rights organizations need to do more of. But the second thing really is the trauma counseling that is now happening among police service. And not a lot of people know this publicly, but there is now a process of looking at how do wounded officers, wounded both physically and emotionally, how do they get rid of the trauma of that so that they are not walking around with post-traumatic stress and therefore liable to just exert pressure and violence on other citizens. So these are the two things that could make a difference. The third one, and I often say this, is actually gender balanced or gender parity in patrolling is an important thing, and it's particularly important for women. But having two men patrolling by themselves, I think is one of the recipes for having the kind of disaster we saw in 2017, when something like 206 women were raped, and some of them gang raped in a period of 5 months.
Yeah. So all of these are, of course, suggestions that are being made. In terms of them having played out, do we see them coming to fruition? Suggestions that you make in your monthly communion, for example, do they actually then come out? Or do you see that these could be something that we could see in the future? Because if we're talking about ending judicial killings in the country, essentially, some of these things will come in place before we get to that expected end.
Yeah. I mean, the data collection that is done by the Missing Voices, and it's a website, so people can go to the website. It's missingvoices.co.ke. You can look at the evidence for yourself. You can do your own analysis. It essentially is an opportunity for the researchers, the research community, but also the police to be able to look at how well are they doing. My question often is, why don't we have similar statistics from the police? Why don't we have similar statistics from the Ministry of Interior? Because I think once you begin to generate data and you have an evidence-based conversation, there's an opportunity to get beyond the drama of accusations and blame and actually look at what is happening. And just that simple, statistic that actually in places like Kibra and in Dandora, the figures went down.
Let me ask the question, Irungu.
Siti, I'm going to ask you to hold on to that question and ask when you come back from a break, and then it will be hot on the heels of that. This is the Situation Room. We are looking at extrajudicial killings in the country, and we're going to take a short break and come back and continue with Kenya's biggest conversation.
.6 Spice FM, Malindi.
Sugar and spice and everything nice.
Since you had that question, it was burning.
It actually
wasn't burning yet?
Not
Okay.
really. It's just that I was thinking about it, and I was thinking that have we actually ever overcome the initial purpose for which the administration police was actually put in place? Remember, it began as the tribal police, 1929, and their purpose was really not complicated. To make sure that these native Africans were put in their place by whatever means possible. All right? And you also have the GSU, who for the longest time were known as Fanya Fujo Uone. So essentially, what happened to communities that the colonial administration deemed to be hostile, that attitude was passed on. So whenever the government of the day felt that there were parts of the citizenry who were not towing the line, they would unleash the GSU on you. What this brings to mind is, it's like these aren't regularly trained. These are paramilitary trained, meaning they are supposed to deal with the insurgents. They're supposed to deal with emergency situations. They are actually not trained to deal with civilians on a daily basis, not really. So their whole reaction to anything that you see before them isn't actually tuned. It's like asking the army to police. What do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to happen?
And isn't that taken into consideration then when it comes to then policing? To say that there's still remnants?
Clearly
not.
it hasn't been taken into consideration.
It seems that it's a conversation that has not even been had before you start talking about then putting things in place to then have this. Because there are clearly remnants of this attitude taking place here. It's some of the things that we see with the killings that we saw yesterday.
It also is a thinking that there's a remnant of the understanding by whoever is in government that you need a unit such as this one to put down any person or individuals who you feel may be a threat to you.
Is that necessary, Rongo?
But, I mean, why do you have such a unit?
Yeah.
Why?
So historically, I think the history of the administrative police is very clear. It was essentially a brutal force. And it was, as you said, it was just to ensure that the natives did not become restless and challenge the colonial settler. We don't require paramilitary policing. We are not in a state of insurgency. In the case of the Kenya Defence Forces, in August last year, a young man by the name of Yusuf Kasim was shot in Garissa, and a number of us travelled to Garissa to provide legal advice, and also to just moral solidarity with the family. And we held a demonstration where we basically marched across the streets of Garissa to simply make the point that the Kenya Defence Forces, who have a military camp in Garissa, should not be essentially policing Garissa. And there's enough evidence. This case has now gone to an inquest. There's enough case to suggest that actually this young man, Yusuf Kassam, was killed as he was coming home late at night at 10 o'clock. And there are some allegations of theft and so on. Now, the key point here is we demanded that base be removed from Garissa town. Now, the good news is, I think somewhere towards the end of the year, that base was actually announced. It was actually announced by the president that the base will be removed from Garissa and taken to another part of the country that is not, I guess, populated by civilians. And I think this point is very important. The administrative police cannot use the same tactics as a paramilitary force or as a paramilitary force, essentially, to police civilians. If they are to police, then they must be brought under the police standing orders that regulate the National Police Service.
Right.
And they cannot. I mean, I think we must demand this as citizens, that you cannot allow people in uniform paid by taxpayers' monies to brutalize other Kenyans.
Now, is it possible to end extrajudicial killings in Kenya? Is it possible with what we see?
It is.
It is not only possible, it is desirable. It is critical for the stability of this country. Violent policing does not, violent policing, the death penalty, does not reduce the crime statistics. In many cases, what we found is that actually the communities are so frightened of the police that they don't yield intelligence, they don't yield information. And that's why the economic survey says something like, I think the increase of crime last year was 31%. It's up 31%. But the number of people who are giving evidence to the police is just only 5%, right? So violent policing actually shuts the police, or rather locks out the police from its capacity to work effectively and be able to target and arrest the criminals that are preying on other Kenyans. So I think that's the first thing. It is not just, it's not just possible, it is actually desirable. And we have to get this in place in the next year or so. As I say, there is a looming revisiting of 2017 if we do not fix this. And it will be found in the area of public order management. Let me give you just two examples very quickly.
Right.
Stephen Makarusi, who was the young man, 17 years, who was killed at the Kasarani Mwiki demonstration.
Yes.
You remember, that was a demonstration. And I think that was, in many ways, a turning point, because it wasn't a conversation around crime. It wasn't a conversation around an altercation between the police and the civilians. What it was a group of civilians demanding that their roads were of a certain quality. Now, what we found was that within 48 hours, the money was found or located through the intervention of the Nairobi senator.
Right.
And the money was actually found. So the question is, what is happening to our public resources that you cannot fix roads? And then when people demonstrate, first of all, the police kill somebody, but secondly, actually the demonstration yields the funding that was required
in the first place. Right.
So there is a systemic failure here, not just at the level of the police service, but also at the level of the government. And I've often said that, our police service are actually asked to do the dirty job. When the state fails to provide services, when it fails to provide opportunities for jobs, what happens is our police officers are brought in to essentially police a dysfunctional state and a dysfunctional economy, right? And I think at some point the Inspector General should say, listen, it's not my job to police people who have no jobs, who have
it's not their job to sort out social issues.
These are social problems.
Yes.
But we often see this, whether you want to look at the police force and you want to look at issues of human rights, whether you want to look at education, whether you want to look at health, there is a general lack of goodwill. There is a general lack of acceptance of responsibility to have something done. Obviously, this is something that is affecting this sector as well. When we're talking about extrajudicial killings, how are we going to get somebody to change their mind or to act on something for which they really don't want to?
Actually, no. The police, I believe, want to bring about change. But consider also, if you think the general public are victims, so are the police. They do not live in a society outside this one of ours. If we have pressures and we have economic ills, so do they.
Well, people don't go around shooting people because they can't figure something out, right?
Yes, that is a simplistic way of looking at it, but we don't have the responsibilities they do. If somebody's under the same pressure as you, and then you add additional pressure of dealing with pressures that amount as a result of these pressures that they have, this is a tinder keg. We can blame them as much as we like, but the pressures that the rest of us feel are heaped upon them, and then you heap responsibility upon them. on top of the burden that they already have. I am saying this, given their training and given their pressures and given their social circumstances, they are likely to react in the most irrational way. They are likely to explode. This is what I'm saying. These cases are too many. We are not talking about the times when policemen kill other policemen. It happens very often too.
Yeah.
But in this case, I mean, with what you started off with, the statistics that we saw, and trying to say, look, if we're talking about ending this thing, then there are very, very many factors that need to work in tandem. We can't say that one then has to be sorted out, and then when we're done with that, we go to the next. It seems that so many things need to be happening at the same time.
But I don't think we need to complicate this matter. It's not a complicated problem, right? And this is why I think, sometimes we tend to get paralyzed. 2 observations. The average age of a criminal or a petty offender, a police officer, and the people that we've just talked about in terms of the missing voices analysis, the average age is between 18 and 35. That's the demographic. And this always shocks me. So the average age of our police officers and the people that they are trying to arrest are roughly the same demographic, right? Which means that you're having to deal with young people, right? Now, the question for me, and I hope this is the question also for the police service, is how do you create disciplined officers? I mean, the one thing that, the language of the police service is discipline. It is true, the second observation I think that CT has raised, police officers kill police officers. They don't just kill their peers, they kill their superiors. Right? And there are many cases of this. So the lawlessness that comes with violent policing doesn't just find itself in the streets of Kenya. It finds itself in the police barracks. It finds itself in the police lines. And I think that's why this issue is really a collective problem that doesn't allow for us to take sides, except on the grounds of how do we bring this to an end.
Okay.
Right? So I'm as happy speaking to police officers as I am to human rights defenders. And sometimes I even argue that police officers, first and foremost, must see themselves as human rights defenders.
It would be very interesting to hear and to understand then what is the view that comes from police officers. We're going to take a break now and get to the top of the hour. And if you let us keep you around for 10 minutes or so thereafter to hear what it is that could be the thinking or the psyche of a lot of police officers who basically have been tasked with this job and then find themselves at the other end of the rifle in this case. So we're going to come back and talk about that. This is the Situation Room. We're having a serious conversation this morning about extrajudicial killings in this country and probably seeking the end of that. Stay around with us. Of course, you can call in at this point, 0719 012 600. Let us know if you do have any questions and let's see how we can open this up just a little bit more. We'll take a look at the state of the roads in a minute and see where you can or cannot go. All right, taking a look at what's happening in Eastleigh, for example. Heavy traffic is caused by matatus this morning and stopping where they shouldn't be. And so that's affecting traffic all the way down back towards 9th Avenue for some reason. So that is then affecting traffic also leaving that particular area. All right, on Red Hill Road, we still have a problem as you approach Limuru Road. It's not moving as fast as we would like it to. Mombasa Road, we still have remnants of the early morning traffic as you try to head to the Nyayo Stadium roundabout. Coming off Langata Road today is not so bad. Wayaki Way also is not giving us a problem either. Coming off Thika Road this morning, not so terrible. As you get to the Pangani underpass and then try to either go towards Parklands or then towards the city centre using the Globe Cinema roundabout, you won't have much of a headache today. So it's a Wednesday and we don't have much of a problem. Spice FM KE is how you can reach us on Twitter. Let us know what you see. If you're stuck somewhere and looking for an alternative or you need somebody to keep you company, do let us know. 0719 012 600 is the number to call. Let us know what you see and we'll keep people moving this morning.
Spice FM, Nyeri. Classic soul, R&B, smooth jazz, neo soul, and nostalgic ballads.
Make some noise. Yeah.
You're listening to Spice FM. Mature, intelligent talk every morning. Spice up yourself. Mornings done right. 94.4 Spice FM, Nairobi. Classic soul, R&B, smooth jazz, neo soul, and nostalgic ballads.
Make some noise. Yeah.
You're listening to Spice FM. Mature, intelligent talk every morning. Spice up yourself. Mornings done right. 94.4 Spice FM, Nairobi. This is The Situation Room, the home of hard-hitting political commentary and penetrating insights about the state of the nation. This is a talk radio experience like no other. The Situation Room, a place for hard truths, debates, and elevated conversations. The Situation Room, witty, political, engaging, deep, controversial. In the room, we have C.T. Muga, researcher, academic, seasoned political observer.
The only way to start your day, this is Kenya's biggest conversation. You're in the Situation Room this morning on Spice FM. If you're tuning in, you are listening to us on 87.9 in Mombasa, 96.0 in Nakuru, 94.4 in Nairobi, of course, Mombasa at 87.9, Malindi at 97.7, and Kisumu at 102.5. My name is Udo Cohen in the studio this morning with C.T. Muga. And we've been having a conversation for the last hour with Executive Director of Amnesty International, Irungu Houghton, and looking at the necessity to end extrajudicial killings before we get to rising temperatures in 2022 elections, for example, which we've seen as, times when some of these things get or fly out of the window. It seems like we've put a timeline on this, Irungu. I know you're going to be with us just for a few more minutes before we're going to let you go, but it seems that we've put a target on this. And is it possible to work with something as volatile as this with timelines?
I mean, I would come at this with the clarity of Wangari Maathai. Wangari once said, when's the best time to plant a tree? If you didn't plant it yesterday, it's today. And when's the next best time to plant a tree? It's tomorrow. So I think the 2022 elections is one deadline that we need to be conscious of. But I think what we need to remember is that for the families of people like Daniel Boro, who lost his life yesterday, that's abstract. I mean, for them, they've lost their child and they can't understand why they would have lost their child, particularly as he was taking an act of just compassion for this young child. So we have to take action immediately, and it's not complicated. Again, it's just it's a conversation. It's a decision that's taken. There are decisions, for example, in the case of Daniel Boro, that would leave me more confident in terms of the zero tolerance within the police service. The first one was announce the names of the officers. Secondly, interdict them, and thirdly, prosecute them. This would be a immediate step to this. Don't rely on the Independent Policing Authority to basically take the next 6 months to do the investigations, and then at that point it'll be referred to the DPP, and then that will take another 6 months. If I had influence over the Inspector General, I would say, listen, I am taking a stand on my officers that says they cannot use lethal force on other Kenyans. It's just not the principle or the vision of a police service that I want to serve. And it is, there are examples. Joash Mbati, I don't know if you remember him. He was an administrative police officer. He came across a group of thieves in a vehicle, and the public cheered on him to kill them. Ua, ua, ua is what they were shouting. We all saw this on a viral video. And he decided that he was not going to do that. He made a different choice. And that choice that he made was to essentially to arrest them and have them prosecuted. he received a commendation by the Deputy Inspector General of the Administrative Police under the Inspector General. But more importantly, I think his action, his choice was one step away from impunity, lawlessness, and more violence, and a step towards an effective policing and accountable policing. We need more Joash Mbatis among us. And, you know, Manu Chandari every year sponsors, I think with the Standard, I think you're involved in this, a Good Officers Award. And I think, you know, for those of us in Amnesty, we often say that actually we do need good officers.
Right.
We are not against officers. We need good officers. But we need to make the distinction. And we need to ask, you know, the police service essentially to start reporting on its own officers.
You know, we know for a fact that at Kiganjo, there is no special training for bad police officers. They all they all undergo the same training. It's not as though there's a select few who are told, now you are going to undergo this training where you will be specialized in extrajudicious killing. So somewhere along the line, the rot sets in. Okay? My final question to, well, I'm saying it, but it won't be.
It won't be the final one.
Is, do we have an effective mental health program that caters for those who are in the police service?
So there is this is one of the breakthroughs, I think, of 2019, and specifically I mentioned the Inspector General of the National Police Service, Hilary Mutambai. What he did was essentially introduce training for officers on trauma counselling. And it's been run by a non-governmental organisation with professional counsellors. And we were at the event last week. Amnesty was invited to the event last week to just understand the training that's happening. We can only wish them well. We can only encourage that to take to be rolled out across the country. And in so doing, I think what it will do is it will actually reduce some of the tensions that officers have had. I've sat with officers who have told me that 12 years ago, and this was in the Kilimani division, an officer told me about a story about how I think it was 12 years before we were having this conversation, he was stabbed repeatedly in a dark alley somewhere in Mombasa, and every time he goes out to his beat, he sweats. Right, it's uncontrollable.
For fear.
Right, because he can still feel what it was like to have a knife, several knives,
plunging into
him. And I could only, I was only left with a sense of courage that this man can get up every day, put on a new uniform, go out and police in places like Kibra, not knowing whether he's going to go home. And I think the danger is real, not just for citizens, it's also real for police officers. And the more that we can, I think, support officers to essentially be lawful and effective in their policing and support them with information that is able to isolate who the violent criminals are, so that they can be arrested and taken through the judicial process, the more we will be safer as a country.
Right. So, I mean, just looking at it, is it possible? I mean, we're saying that we're getting to a time in 2020 where we're likely to see the volatility of a situation rise in temperatures. What we're saying is that we're hoping that an attitude change would have taken place sufficient enough to realize that this is what we are seeing and this is what could come about if we don't take that into check.
So the laws and the broad policies are in place. I mean, this is, I think we can
agree on that.
The laws we agree, but
yes.
Let me ask again, does the police force have a program or a process that they have considered in making them more user-friendly to the public?
Yeah, so like a customer service.
Yes, because our
strategy.
police, the image that the common Mwananchi has of the police is not pleasant or friendly.
I mean, it is one of the things that we've actually discussed with several police officers, whether at the level of the stations. The role of an officer in charge of a station now is actually much more complex than it was even 2 years ago, because that officer is now responsible for managing not just the regular police service, but the administrative police service, has jurisdiction over the chiefs and the assistant chiefs, and also has responsibility for the Director of Criminal Investigation as well. So there are a number of agencies that historically, in the case of, for example, if you take the case of Willie Kimani, one of the things that made that very complicated was administrative police officers who obviously were corrupted and misusing the law, took the three gentlemen and placed them in containers And there is no occurrence book that the administrative police use separately from the one that we have in police stations. It was an ungazetted police station in that sense. It was basically a container. And I think what the reforms have given us as an opportunity now is to just have a point of accountability. What we need now to work is that those officers, not just the ones who pull the trigger, but those officers who do not take action on the officers that pull the trigger, that they are also held culpable.
That they're also held culpable.
That's the difference. I mean, what we do know in all our spaces is that culture eats policy and strategy for breakfast, right? So just because we have laws, just because we have policies, just because we have an announcement of police reforms, if we are not actively working on this culture, we are going to have a culture and a constitution that actually bear no resemblance. They're not a mirror for each other.
Irungu, it's always enlightening to have you here. Thank you very much. Of course, hoping to see that things actually do change on both sides of the divide, wherever they are, and looking at ending extrajudicial killings in this country, hoping to have a total attitude change overall. Thanks for always being available to come and shed light on this, and the work that is being done obviously is not in vain. Thank you very much for being in the Situation Room today. Of course, we will see you in the future once again.
Thank you very much, both of you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Irungu.
In Nairobi today, we see partly cloudy conditions through the day, currently at 19 degrees with highs of 26 and lows of 16. In Mombasa at 29 degrees, it's going to be sunny conditions through the day with highs of 33 and lows of 26. 24 degrees in Kisumu, highs of 30 and lows of 20 and partly cloudy conditions. In Nakuru at 19 degrees, it's going to be partly cloudy through the day with highs of 26 and lows of 14. In Malindi at 28 degrees, highs of 32 and lows of 27. It's 19 degrees in Nyeri, rainy conditions later on with highs of 23 and lows of 14. Further afield in Kampala, it's 21 degrees, partly cloudy conditions, rain expected later on with highs of 28 and lows of 20. And finally in Dar es Salaam at 27 degrees, going to be a warm day with highs of 33 and lows of 26. This is the Situation Room right here on
Spice up your life.
94.4 in Nairobi. Tuned in all across the country, I hope. And what we are seeing
Mature,
is
intelligent talk every morning. Done right. 94.4 Spice FM, Nairobi.
And see what is happening in the West African nation of Cameroon. And of course, we've seen that the numbers of deaths that we've seen as a result of clashes between separatists and what would be the government, whereby the separatists represent 20% of English-speaking Cameroon. And of course, the government represents the 80% of French-speaking Cameroon. There has been a conflict. And there are things going on that has now raised international eyebrows. And people saying, here we have a result of conflicts that have taken place over time, but now where we see over 3,000 people dead as a result of this, 70,000 people being displaced as a result of this, what we have is a situation that cannot be allowed to get out of control. Now, of course, what has happened is that it has been over and over cycles of violence between these two groups, and the president then not having taken control of this. This is historical, of course, because when the French came in and basically colonized different parts of rather the majority of Cameroon, most having gone that way, the northeast and the southeast then were not taken over by the French, and that remained in the purview of the British. Now that has taken control until present day, whereby the separatists are looking then for their own nation, and they're trying to look to secede because they are not understood in any way, shape or form. And we are seeing a state where they hope will be called Ambazonia. And they want to be able to move away from mainland Cameroon and have their own country. But, of course, the government is not allowing this. But what I'm saying this morning is that as we continue to look at how things have unfurled in Cameroon, it's clear to us that when you have injustices that have not been dealt with over time, they creep into a system or a governance way of doing things that then would result in conflict and then result in things like human rights violations in terms of now making sure that one element of society is kept suppressed and their rights and their interests are not taken into consideration. It's been clear over time that the English-speaking part of Cameroon has not been considered when it comes to the national cake or the national way of doing things. And I'm saying today that this is an example of how if things like cohesion, when it comes to a state, are not taken into consideration, if things like human rights, if things like that like historical injustices have not been then taken into consideration, this is what we have today. A situation that now the world is watching, where so many people have died and so many people have been displaced, a country wanting to cede on a systemic issue. This is what we have today. And it is very easy to get from the point whereby we're having a conversation to a part where we're having conflict, and then people want to secede rather. And if we don't look at that, it is very easy for any country, looking at the continent and what we are facing, it's very easy for any country to move from that point to what we see now. And in Cameroon, it's clear that, things could get worse if it's not reined in today. Do they want to secede? Absolutely. Do they want their own government? Yes, because they've not been recognized. And if that is not nipped in the bud, you're going to have an unfolding situation that will not be able to control. Things are not good in Cameroon city right now.
No, they're not. But, one of the things that must be borne in mind is that in 1953, the Southern Cameroonians led a delegation to the conference in Atlanta to ask for a separate region. This isn't the first time they're asking for it.
No.
Okay.
The Southern Cameroonians, of course, being the English-speaking.
That is,
yes.
And the truth of the matter is that the British agreed. Okay. And this really isn't the problem. The problem is that the oversight that is lauded upon them by the French-speaking part of what we now consider the entire of Cameroon is where the problem is. If you listen to some of the complaints that have been leveled over time, apart from what we like referring to as development, not going to them, neglect takes these forms. One, what you see happening in other parts of the country that are French-speaking, you do not see happening in the English-speaking. You have a situation where the judicial system, for instance, you have French-speaking judges and magistrates in places where people speak the English language, and they want to conduct their business in French, in total disregard to the fact that these people may not actually speak French. But again, this has a historical bearing to it. What we know, this southern part of Cameroon, it was actually set up as a colony for people who had been freed, people who had previously been slaves.
Yes.
This is how it began. Okay.
It was essentially a slave protectorate.
It was.
Ex-slave protectorate.
Yes.
In this case.
And the British came, the British had a say in it, but at some point just before the war, the British handed over this territory to the Germans. The Germans did not seem to be able to control this region, the entirety of this region. So they more or less sort of like backed away. Now, the moment you have powers changing positions, and then you have a world war, you have a partition of Africa, you have this leading world powers playing their part and playing their chess games on you. What you're now seeing is the ramification of all this. Because the division that began then is now playing out and into full bloom right now. But then it brings out a lack of astute leadership in those who have been head of Cameroon, because it needn't have gotten to this stage.
Oh no, it didn't, because again we're looking at 20% of the population.
Yes.
For whom were not, and still are not, according to what they feel and perceive, are not being included cohesive.
Yes.
Cohesion is what we're looking at now. And how many times across the world, even in Kenya where we are today, there's certain groups, certain regional groups who feel that they've not been included in part of the national cake, as it were, in part of, national politics, in part of taking part in what is happening on a national scale. And what do? They say, well, okay, at some point then, since we're not being included, we might as well run ourselves, which is what is happening right now in what they're calling Ambazonia. They have their own government.
Yes.
They are ruling themselves. They do whatever they need to do and are not taken into consideration by the rest of the government.
They did have something which was akin to a referendum in 1959, where some of them felt that they wanted to align themselves with Nigeria. Others, the northern part, others felt they would stay. Unfortunately, the vast majority felt being part of a larger Nigeria may not help them.
Would not help them, right.
So they preferred to move towards Cameroon, meaning they gave it an okay. They said we can coexist. But look at what it is that happens when a group of people feel that they are marginalized, because that's what it is. Sri Lanka. Think of any country in this world that later became independent and were part of another country at some point. What leads to the eventual separation is them feeling that they were not being taken care of. To put it simply, why did Eritrea move away from Ethiopia?
Of course, because they felt that their needs were not being met, or in terms of their interests were not being included when it came to issues of national, franchisement, as it were. They were not being included in the whole, in the way things were being done.
Yes.
And so rather than continue in this manner, we might as well go and form our own, because that seems to be the way in which we're living anyway.
Yes, we might as well just let us do our own business.
Absolutely.
Remember, the thing that happened even in this country after the 2017 election, discussions and debates about secession came into being. Now, it's something that must be taken with the utmost seriousness. We had problems at the coast when there was a declaration, Pwani si Kenya. Okay? The moment people in the northern part of Kenya have for the longest time felt that they were profiled and that they were marginalized and they were not treated like other Kenyans. The shifter war that we had in the 60s was as a result of this. People feeling we're not really part of this. Now, whenever a government is careless enough not to consider the interests of people who are within their boundaries and to treat those people with the same, or give them the same treatment as everybody else, please expect that you are going to have this discussion and people are going to feel that they might as well be on their own, because after all, their interest is not taken care of when they're with you.
Then it behoves government, because look at what we're talking about now with the current, political dispensation in Kenya, with the BBI. The one word that has come out very clearly in all of this is cohesion, are coming together, because the reality that things could split wide open once you have groups or pockets of people who feel in this certain way, the next thing that they would want to do is separate from you, right? And you want to at least be seen to know that you have things being put together. President Paul Biya in Cameroon, for example, has been accused of very many things over the last few years. But in this case, he's been accused of not paying adequate attention to this. That, 20% of your population is enough of a number to consider if they decide they don't want to be part of this whole, thing that you're putting together. If they decide they don't want to be part of it, it's quite a significant number for you to pay some attention to. Of course, he's been accused and they said, look, you're not paying attention to this thing. Call it conflict today, it'll be war tomorrow.
Actually, in 1961, they actually became part of Cameroon, and they were known as West Cameroon then. And they even had their own prime minister.
They did.
But you see, apart from just the issue of the language, there is the issue of resources. Southern Cameroon has a lot of natural resources.
Which is why you can see now the problem that they are very apprehensive, kindly, to let them go.
Yes.
So by the time they're saying they want to rule themselves, and you have the separatists then fighting what are still known as the French government forces, it is a resource issue. That's why, because you would ordinarily have said, okay, they're kicking up a fuss, let them go. But they're not going to let them go, because a lot of the resources for which then the Greater Cameroon depends on comes from the south.
But you see, the thing is, in 1972, they changed the constitution. So Southern Cameroon lost their autonomy. Now, you see, this is where the problem comes in. They lost their autonomy, and in so doing, they suddenly felt, okay, we no longer have a say on what we're doing. The president, the overall president of Cameroon, then acquired powers. Now, there are times when you have a minority of people in your borders, you need to consider them. I'll give you an example of Southern Africa. Right now, there are issues surrounding, it began so innocuously, a comment that a former president made during an interview. It's now unearthing the one thing that probably one would wish it wouldn't come into a debate, the deals that were made upon the attainment of independence. Apart from just those who had previously been in power retaining what they had, there was a small clause that isn't spoken of, the understanding that should they wish to secede, they could.
They could.
Now, these were clever people who knew that if somebody wants something that badly, let them know.
Let them go.
Let them say they can have it. They'll sit back comfortably because knowing they have an option. If you don't provide that option, you will have conflict. Now, in Kenya, sometimes back, we had a very serious issue in our constitution about, now this was brought by our churchmen, Islam within the constitution. Hey, it raised dust.
Oh, fire, of course.
It was an
It was
issue.
a whole Carvis Courts issue.
You actually wanted to ask, but these are Kenyan citizens, for
First.
heaven's sake.
Kenyans first.
Yes.
Right.
So surely if they subscribe to a certain faith, shouldn't that faith be considered like others? Now, I consider it the height of unreasonableness and intolerance. Okay? But there is a certain logic. Why do you think it is, for instance, that the United States functions? Because some sense of autonomy is given to the individual states. Okay? They are even allowed to make their laws. So you can have laws that differ from state to
Oh,
state.
absolutely. And these could even be neighboring states. That there's certain
Yes.
things that you could do here, you
Yes.
can't necessarily do here.
Yes.
Oh, okay, you're allowed to do this.
Yes.
We on this side are not.
Yes.
You know? So yes, of course, the autonomy then exists. But in this case, you can't have autonomy whereby they're not going to give autonomy to a group of people where the bulk of the natural resources lie, and that group of people happens to be in the lower percentages.
But you see,
There's no way Paul Biya and his government are going to allow that to happen.
This is the short-sightedness of it all. This is what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to point to the short-sightedness of it. Remember, in this country, in 2017, the issues, even prior to that, the issues we've had surround this very same thing we're saying. A winner take all with our presidential election. We've gone round in circles and figured, this thing is not going to work.
It's not going to work.
It's not going to work. It causes too much upheaval. Let's look for something else that doesn't put so much power in the hands of one individual. Let's dissipate it a little bit.
And this is an example of why. Cameroon is a glaring example of why you don't want that to happen. Because at the end of the day, again, going back to Biya, this is it. He is the one to decide. He is the one who would call a snap election. And this is what he did. Call an election then. If people are not happy, call an election and let's see what they do. Lo and behold, they chose him once again to be president. Whether he had anything to do with that is another story it's a story for another day. But here you are with one individual. All of the pressure is on his shoulders. All then of the responsibility again is on his shoulders, and then he then has the purview of doing whatever it is that he or she wants at that point. And this is what we've seen, and it is dangerous. So perhaps it points to another direction where we should be taking and saying, actually, systems of government, you should look at what has happened historically, taking all of those things into consideration, and then on that premise, be able to form a system of government that works for your people and not for you as an individual. Look at what's happening. Something that started out as a conflict where 2 or 3 people were dying to now where we have 70,000 people displaced, 3,000 people having been killed, and only forecasted to get worse.
Actually, people who've moved from their homes have reached almost 500,000, to be honest.
And with only a forecast
Yes.
of getting worse, it's
Yes.
going to get worse because the man is not blinking when it comes to this. He's not interested in that, but more interested in what are we then going to be able to get in terms of resources. So the conflict continues, and looking at changing systems of government is the last thing on their list of desires.
Do you know what they desired when they called the conference in 1961 for the Anglophone part of the country? They just wanted to go back to the previous state that they were in. They were not asking to secede. No. What they were asking for was, if you think of it, even reasonable. It was actually saying, look, right now we're having a debate in this country about devolution. And we're saying devolution is being frustrated because there are elements within government who seem determined that they must control even functions that have been devolved. And the question has been asked, how do you say it's devolved when the bulk of the vast majority of the funds are still centralized within the government, and the people who need it most in the devolved units don't have it? So how is it devolved?
We're not going to be able to make it work, of course, having those conversations. But you can imagine now operating in a country whereby the place for this discussion to happen does not exist.
No.
The debate, when you're going to talk about national debate, it doesn't happen. Nobody's listening. Nobody's ears are even open to make sure that takes place. Of course, pertinent questions that we're asking this morning, looking at what's happening in Cameroon and how we can make that example known here in terms of how government systems need to change, or in some cases, the whole conversation needs to be turned on its head. This is Kenya's biggest conversation. You are in the Situation Room this morning. Ndroko and Siti Muga opening up issues. We'll be back in a short while taking a look at what's happening on the roads. Don't go away. Looking much better on Mombasa Road right now as you're trying to get into the city centre. We don't have much problems there. Looking around different parts of the city, of course, Langata Road, what is wrong? This is the problem. All the way between Bunyala and Langata Road, right around the Nyayo Stadium roundabout. It's not moving. People have been there for a while. Of course, this has everything to do with traffic cops and how they control the traffic. So in this point, we just have to be patient, folks. All right. So traffic not so terrible right now in different pockets of the city where we had clogged up places on Jogo Road previously. That has now opened up. Not too much of a problem. Coming off Thika Road as well. It's moving now. Not a bumper to bumper situation. Slowly, but it's moving anyway. Coming out of Limuru Road past the village market where we saw that there was some traffic, then being able to get down past the Aga Khan Hospital and then into Parklands. That has opened up as well. Not moving as slowly as it was before. So out of traffic hour, hunky dory, guys. Spice FM KE is how you can reach us on Twitter, or give us a call on 0719012600 if you see something out of the ordinary. If not, enjoy it for now, folks.
.5 Spice FM, Kisumu.
In the Situation Room this morning, my name is Ndroko and we're in the studio with CT Muga today, unraveling issues of what we see in Cameroon having taken place when conversations are not being had, where the debate is not at national level, and you have groups of people who feel that this is not for them. Of course, taking a look at that situation and saying that, you know what, then it's probably necessary. And if you want to localize that issue now, because at the point where it is, it's beyond boiling point in Cameroon, and of course, international calls are taking place for Biya to take control of his government, not turn a blind eye to what's happening in terms of human rights abuses and the murders that we see happening right now, to take that and to take this thing by the reins and say, if you don't do it now, you're going to get a little bit beyond conflict. It's not just going to be conflict. It's going to be all-out war.
Oh, but it's gotten there.
Oh, it's beyond conflict now.
Oh, it's gotten
there. We're getting to warlike situations. The separatists are holding on to this stick, as however short it seems. The government is also holding on to their side and saying, we're not going to just let it go like that. But the conversation needs to happen. And I think that where we see conversations happening, then you see where the debate now moves beyond selfish interests and then goes towards how you can, bring inclusivity and cohesion in a nation. And in order for you to see things like development happening, you don't have unity, you don't have inclusion, you don't have cohesion, it's impossible for it to happen. And like you said, you want to go and see Cameroon, you still have some of the poorest conditions on the continent as a result of this.
You know what is strange is that you can actually see how this thing progressed. These people did not want to secede. No. They were simply saying...
They were just asking for representation.
Yes. We are this autonomous state that we had. And we just want it back. Because as far as they are concerned, they were annexed. Here we are, with our autonomous state, and we were relating to you. And suddenly you decide to take over. Now, that is just not the thing you do when you want to have a working relationship with someone, because essentially you're communicating that you have a total disregard for whatever it is that they want. Now, when they then take this matter to the next step, and it's an all-out war, you're now dealing with something completely different. Because previously you were just talking.
And you can understand what the conversation was before, because when you talk about the differences between language, because that was it, French and English, you're not just talking about that people speak a different language. You're looking at entire systems of doing things. You know that in Cameroon, at some point, in the French part of the country, you keep on one side of the road. In the English part, you keep on a different side.
Yes.
In the universities, everything is taught in French.
Yes.
On the other side, in the universities in the south, everything is taught in English. So if you didn't learn the language and you want to now migrate to the northern part of the country, you're at a loss. They're dealt in a different kind of language. The government the government operates in a language. It's not just a language. It's a system. So you can imagine the 20% of a population feeling disenfranchised, not just because of not being able to speak a language, but being on the outside of a system that is carrying the day.
Yes,
right.
And a system that you're supposed to be part of.
That you should be part of, because when you go outside of the country, you're not known as French or English Cameroon. You're known as Cameroon.
Okay, the All Anglophone Conference of 1994 in Bamenda, they asked again. They called the Bamenda Declaration. They wanted the federal state to be restored again, and they said, "Look, if it isn't so, then they will declare its independence." Meaning, remember, this discussion was, you're talking 20 years have gone by. You've gone beyond 20. People are still talking. They're still discussing it. We had a similar situation of sorts in Canada when the Quebecans, who speak French, wanted to secede. Yes, didn't go very far with it. And they've never actually given up trying. The issue of language took center stage. You cannot say that Quebecians are treated badly or they're not treated as well as... No. Quebec has something that is unique in it, or rather Canada. It is, they have bilingual signs.
Yes.
You see? So it isn't...
Throughout the country.
Yes, so it isn't as though one language is given precedence over the others. Just that certain provinces speak a certain language more than the other. Okay? But consider, in Spain, we've had the same issue. The Basque.
Right.
Again, you could argue it's language, but some of these things go beyond language. It is what you call self-determination. People within a certain part of the country feeling, we'd like to have a little more say in our lives.
In what's going on in this country.
Than somebody else telling us what to do. Something quite as simple.
Even from a participatory level, we want to be able to participate. Now, you can imagine how will I participate if I've been cut off because of the way, the language that I speak, that which I've been brought up speaking, in a system or a way of governance, I'm cut off. In terms of how we trade, again, because of the system of the language, I am cut off. On so very many levels, individuals and then, of course, then the larger groups are cut off. It is enough for them to feel this way. The difficulty of Bia, for example, in this country, having some elements of cohesion or inclusion is not very high. If he was paying attention to what could be the outcome of his ignorance of what is really going on just under his nose, if he paid a little bit more attention, perhaps we would not be where we are today. And to even listen, to say this is what people are saying. Is this not what is going on in the country right now? Is this not what we hear? I mean, we've got splashes in the newspaper today of BBI and they're giving this information today and saying, look, guys, tell us what it is that you actually think. Let it not be that anybody at some point will come and say that we are not aware of what's going on or that we did not participate at any level. In this sense, taking everybody's, or rather at least the purview or the perceptions of different groups of people into consideration is of utmost importance. Again, to avoid the problems that we are seeing now.
If you look at what we're now calling the crisis in Cameroon, the progression is well documented. And a lot of it was just conversation. They even went as far as a referendum where they say at least they got a 99% yes. Then there was the issue of the imposition of the judges, and they said, these guys speak French, all right? Now, if you must, can you translate these laws that you're talking about?
Into English.
Yes, just translate it so that we understand, all right? And then they're abrogating the common law that we understand and which we'd like to teach in our universities. Can we then have these changes made? Now, you look at what the Cameroonian government did, and you ask yourself, were they pushing these people to secede?
Actually pushing them to get into a position of conflict. That's what it
Yes.
seemed like. And serve it up right now. Basically, throwing you into the pool and
Yes.
saying, okay, go ahead.
Yes.
Because to do this thing would really not have been so difficult. It would not have
It
been
didn't need to be a
difficult.
teeth-pulling exercise.
It didn't need to get to this point.
Yes.
But do you see how easy it is to get into conflict? And I think that's something that we need to look at. How easy it is for you to tip the scales. People have been talking, raising issues over time, and nothing is done about it. It becomes very easy to cross over to conflict.
The people who in some way actually really very cleverly tried to maneuver around this was the apartheid system. What they used to call Bantustans.
Right.
Okay? Meaning they choose some really semi-arid part of the country. Tell you, we've given you your
Take
country.
this one.
Please, it is yours. Rule it.
As you see fit.
And you look at this terrain that you're being given to rule, there isn't much going on there. Okay? But they were then claiming that, we've allowed them to rule themselves.
You've given them something.
To rule.
Right.
And that something was amounted to almost near nothing. But at least they could claim, well, it's their piece of land, they can make their laws, they can decide what they like to do. But the truth of the matter was that it was still controlled from Pretoria. Okay? What is strange is this, if you look at, say, countries, the two countries that I want to think of. Well, let me talk about three and talk about the other two. One was Yugoslavia, and how Tito brought all those countries in the Balkan areas together to form Yugoslavia. And upon his death, the thing just disintegrated, okay? But again, times. Then I look at Garibaldi, okay? And I look at what he did with Italy. Remember, most people don't know that Italy was not unified, okay? Somebody had to unify. Then there was Germany. Germany was not as we know it. No. They had provinces and separate states. But if you went to those countries, even now that they are one unified country,
Right.
you would see the differences.
You'll see the differences. I mean, if you talk East-West Germany, if you're walking through Berlin, for example, it is very clear when you get into East Berlin. Everything changes. Even now, and we're talking about how many years after the fall of the Berlin Wall?
It's many.
Many, many years. But the
Yes.
differences are still clear. However, you can also see that they tried to do something about it.
Oh, they've tried very hard.
Yeah, they've tried to do something about it. And at least try to make the gap between these differences close in. In Cameroon, unfortunately, it's being looked at. It's not even being talked at. And I am saying at this point, it would get much worse. When you have systems of government that don't take into consideration what the people's interests are at the heart of the matter, you will have very easily gotten to the point where you tip over into conflict. And that is something that we need to look at. It could be called a very archaic manner of doing things, but that's how people think. If you're not giving me what I am essentially agitating for me to then cross over where I continue to be a thorn in your flesh, it's very easy for that to happen.
Federalism isn't a new concept. And we've seen it work, all right? Like, many people don't actually know, for instance, that... Let me talk about the provinces in Germany. You have Bavaria, you have Bremen, you have Hamburg, you have Hesse, you have Saxony. And there's a place, I'm going to pronounce like an African, Thuringia. Okay? Now, if you go to these places, you'll find they have distinctions. In even the food that they eat, there'll be some commonality, the way people dress.
Yes.
Even the way they speak. Same language, but the way they look at things. And part of it has to do with who and where they border. Okay? Now, anyone who understands the concept of federalism understands that it exists because people agree to work with those differences. Someone doesn't try to impose their will and say, this is a must. I was listening today to BBC and something very interesting came up, that there is a state in the US that is in the process of legalizing polygamy among consenting adults.
Right.
Previously, it was considered illegal, but it was treated in the same way a parking ticket was treated.
A slap on the wrist.
Yeah, slap on the wrist.
A slap on the wrist is sufficient.
Exactly. Now, it means that if you feel that you're inclined towards having more than one wife, then you go to that state. But you are still in the US. In the state next door, you will be jailed.
You will be jailed.
Yes.
Absolutely.
But they have learned to live with these differences. Yes. Now, it looks like Cameroon are determined to live in the past.
This is the thing. A very, very old, archaic way of doing things, determined to pull themselves or push themselves right into conflict. And this is not even about the people. This is the leadership. Front, square, center. Leadership has a responsibility that they are not fulfilling. And if they don't, things are likely to get a lot worse. This is Kenya's biggest conversation. We're talking about systems of government this morning, of course, with a spotlight on Cameroon and what is happening there. Keep it here. We're going to take a short break and come back and continue with this conversation.
Spice FM. Spice up your life.
Right. So in the Situation Room this morning, having a look in terms of what's happening in West Africa. My name is Ndoko. In the studio this morning was Siti Muga. And trying to say, you know what? It's looking at what's going on if we across the board. And it's very easy. But I think this is now the responsibility that leadership has. Being able to take a view of what is happening under your watch and say, look, unless you really don't care, then of course you shouldn't be in that position. But then being able to say, this is what we see, this is how we feel that people should be able to participate. Those voices, don't do what you should do to silence them, but actually see how you can work together. So if you want to bring it to Kenya and bring it, a little bit closer home, then perhaps this thing of national inclusion and unity that has been touted for the last 30, 40, 50 years is actually something that should be listened to.
Actually, even though it sounds like the same thing being said over and over again, let it be said. Because at least you hear it and you think about it, because you keep hearing it. And at some point it will take root. Because in all honesty, even before the colonialists came and decided to call us Kenya, we were separate units just functioning within a certain space. Each with their own little thing, getting along with people as we saw fit.
Each onto their own.
We didn't even think of ourselves as Kenyan at some point. We didn't even know it existed. But now that we do, we also realize the benefits of this sort of cohesion. And we look at the benefits of the diversity that we have. Sometimes when people talk about tribalism in Kenya, the thing that I find most fascinating is how they consider that we have a problem. Let me explain what I mean. If you look at the population of this country and you look at what we call the division of communities, what we have otherwise referred to as tribes. Kenyans has how many tribes? 42?
42 right now. I think it was at 43 most recently.
Uganda has 65. Ethiopia has 80. Tanzania has 120. So what on earth are we talking about?
What's the problem?
Where is the problem?
Where is the problem? Nigeria has 312.
Yes. Where is the problem?
Where is the problem?
Exactly.
That you can't get two different language-speaking groups to be able to operate. This is now where the greed and necessity of control of resources then comes into play. Because at the end of the day, we're going to point the finger back at the resource aspect of all of this. Because if the South didn't have the resources that they do in Cameroon, this hullabaloo that we're looking, all this noise for the last 5 years, since 2016, October, would not be taking place. People will not be having this conversation. We would not be talking about this thing if resources were not involved.
This refusal to actually understand cohesion, look at what it's done to Somalia. Meaning you've given rise to a body of what we now refer to as terrorists, who no one likes.
Right. Well, the world over.
Well, even they bother everybody. They don't make life easy for anybody. But in the absence of that cohesion and order, of course you expect such groups to rear their head. It's a perfect ecosystem in which they can exist. Because if there's no law and order, and then everyone has an opportunity to create their order. And this is what you have. Now, if you look at Somalia as we now speak, they say they have a unified president. There are parts of Somalia that assume that that's a fairy tale. Yes.
They ask you what
Yes.
what do you see?
They have their own
what it is
leaders,
that you're
yes,
talking about.
and they go about their business, and they are going about their business. Sometimes there's an argument that this may not be good. I argue it could be. If they've agreed as that unit, whether it's a clan or a combination of clans, and they have cohesion and they work, that is good in that at least there's a body and a body of leaders who can now have discussions with another body of leaders. Yes.
Of course, taking into consideration that all of these geographical demarcations that we talk about, which we know as countries today, were not of our own doing.
No, they were not.
Tribes were separated. People who normally would have done business were separated. People who now traded into tribal trading and things like this. Kingdoms that obviously knew how to operate, governments that had been set in place for things to be done, were separated with this geographical demarcation. They were separated. And then, of course, now became parts of other countries. You can imagine the British came in, colonized a certain part, and then went away, colonized another part, but then was still part of one country. So these demarcations came as a result of them having not anything to do with that decision. So now later on, when they want to say that, actually, you know what, we are alike and we feel that we can actually rule ourselves, there's actually nothing wrong with saying, all right, then in this case, carry on. However, if it comes into debate that they actually will then move away with the resources upon which you depend as a greater nation, then there will be cause for conflict.
What is of
that is why
interest?
you need to actually make sure that you pat their back a little bit stronger to make sure that they don't leave.
Do you remember the Biafran War in Nigeria?
In Nigeria, of course.
Resources were at the center of it.
Of course, yeah. The rich southeast wanted to leave.
Yes.
Yeah.
They wanted to secede. Now, that caused a lot of bloodshed.
Till today, there are people who still recognize themselves as citizens of the great country of Biafra.
To date.
Oh, yes.
To date.
To date. To date.
If you go to, say, the borders of Kenya, you look at Maasai land and how the community that you call the Maasai and just how the numbers that they have in Tanzania, okay? Now, these borders, of course, are of our making. They just crisscross.
Yes.
Because there's no fence dividing them. If you look at the Samia, for instance, in Western Kenya, a very large portion of the community is in Uganda. The Pokot, the same. You look at the Kuria community in Kenya. In fact, the larger group of Kuria is actually in Tanzania, not even in Kenya. Now, if you look at, say, the Luo community, you'd be amazed at just the number of communities within Tanzania who, in Kenya, you'd call Luo because they speak the same language.
Same language.
But they're Tanzanians by virtue of this demarcation. When people don't understand the necessity of living with diversity, then you'll not, this is a mishmash. You will have a non-functioning society. You will have a non-functioning country. Any country that has been able to survive, think about it. Great Britain has Ireland, it has Wales,
Scotland,
and then you have the English. Any country that has survived and has any form of greatness, if you look at it, believe me, it is a country that has understood how to bring the diversity together and function with those diversities. That is how, when you hear of Japan, you think it's one cohesive country. It is.
It is.
But it has a diversity of communities within that very country. There is no country in the world that doesn't have the diversity. They do. You can call it tribe. You can call it clan. You can call it what you like. But those distinct divisions actually exist. Or should you call it distinctive features? They actually exist.
What we see then as countries or nations having been able to keep it together is a direct result of the leadership being invested in making sure that they can keep it together. What you see then now turning into conflict means the exact opposite, that leaders have not then taken the responsibility to make sure that they make sure that everybody is aligned, because really what these folks are asking for is really not much, and it's okay for you to want to do that. So then when we talk about the fact that there's still archaic ways of doing things on the African continent, then I'm inclined to agree. And if we have countries whereby you can't even see yourself putting your citizens at the forefront of anything, then yes, I'm inclined to agree in that direction as well. If we have somebody who's been at the seat of power for a long time and is not even taking the human rights or social injustices of their people into consideration, then absolutely, yes, we're still living in very archaic times. And then how are we going to even move to, you call it third world developing, dark, black, what you call it, for us to even move to just developing, then there's a lot of work that needs to be done. People have to, it's a mindset thing. And the leadership, yes, in most cases is what ails us. Here, a very glaring example of just that. The people cannot be protected because the interests of the leader are actually not aligned to theirs.
Bring it home. You can't have change when you've had a president for as long as you've had the president of that country. He's one of the longest serving presidents on the continent.
On the continent,
Sorry,
absolutely.
the world, sorry.
In the world, actually. Let's
perspective.
make it a little...
Exactly. So, do you really think his thinking will have changed much in all these years? No. Because he was there at the beginning of the problems that have now mushroomed to what we see. So, how likely is he to actually bring about change? If there was change, we would have seen change even in the president or in a constitution that allows for change.
If we had seen change, he wouldn't be there.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Somebody else would have been there. And even this discourse that we're talking about, which brings me home again, that on a positive note, we should be grateful for the little mercies we have in that we actually have a situation in this country where not only do we celebrate diversity, but we have a situation where we have a constitution that is adhered to.
Oh, absolutely. And I think also a situation where raging debates can take place. Constantly. And I think this is actually something to be grateful for. You don't want to be a situation where you're muzzled, you're not allowed to speak out. And if anything, the state forces come against you. If you want to if you want to come up with an argument that you actually are not being considered. A situation like that is not the nicest to be in. We saw it happen in Sierra Leone. We saw it happen in Liberia, where thousands of people were killed because of groups rising up, rebels as they then were called later on, because they wanted to have a debate. They wanted to have systems of inclusion put in place, and it never happened. And what do we have? War. We're not even talking about conflict. Graduated very quickly to war. So in Kenya, where you have a raging debate is allowed to continue over time, people are actually given an opportunity to speak and talk about changes that they want to see. It's something worth being thankful for.
History bears this out. The so-called the revolutions that we speak of, beginning with the Russian, going to the French, talking about, even in the UK, talking about the monarchy being fought. All these things arose because those in leadership failed to consider the other people that they shared that country with. They looked after their own vested interests, whether it was a minority, but they didn't consider. So the other fellows figured, something, why don't we look at our own interest? And the problem is it may begin with a small number of people. You actually do not know how far this thing can actually spread.
Right.
Who would have thought that the disgruntlement within the Arab nations in the Middle East, who would have thought that slight disgruntlement in those countries that had been ruled by the same person for God knows how long, who would have thought that a new generation would come and say, we're not putting up with this? Who would have thought? And the problem with that is that the whole country now goes topsy-turvy. And reining that in becomes a totally different discussion, albeit a really very difficult discussion.
A really very difficult discussion. Yes. So, of course, then giving rise to, again, as we come to the top of the hour this morning in the Situation Room and looking at, what we've been discussing today, to be thankful for certain things that happen in this country where you're able to have open and honest discussions. Of course, keeping a watch on what's going on in the West African nation of Cameroon and saying, if it's not reined in now, and of course, unless the president doesn't do something about this with his, of course, very able group of advisors to say something then needs to be done. It's been great having you in the Situation Room this morning. We'll do it again tomorrow. And we'll be here to continue with Kenya's biggest conversation. CT, say bye.
Goodbye and have a nice day.
Let the conversation continue.
Yes.
Of course. Keep it here because from 10 o'clock, definitely Spice Soul with some of the oldies but goodies. And that will take you up until 3 o'clock where you have Monique on the Spice Drive and she'll take you through to 7 p.m. The adults in the room, of course, will take on from 7 to 10 with Barbara Mbaka, Emmanuel Kisiangani and Eric Omondi taking you to that. We'll talk again tomorrow. It's almost 10 o'clock, but for now, remember that the conversation will continue as best we know it, and we'll have yourselves a good day, and we'll talk again tomorrow.